And hello, church history friends, and welcome to the Stories of the Scattered Saints Spring Lecture Series. My name is Barb Walden, and it's a joy to welcome you to tonight's program with Amy DeRogatis. I hope you're as excited as I am to explore the fascinating story behind Charley Douglass, also known as Elvira Eliza Field. Now, joining me today are my two co-hosts, Peter Smith and Lexi Frazier. These two are taking care of all the behind-the-scenes magic that comes along with an online series. Peter serves as a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and as a co-host of our Historic Site Bus Tour. Lexi is serving her second year as a summer intern in the Alma Blair Internship Program at the Kirtland Temple. Welcome, Peter and Lexi. Thank you both for joining us tonight. The Spring Lecture Series is not only a great way to get together to learn some church history, it's also an opportunity to help support church heritage. In fact, tonight I have an awesome matching gift opportunity to share. As many of you know, each spring we raise funds to help support the Alma Blair Internship Program. However, this year the spring campaign is bittersweet for us, as Alma Blair, our mentor and colleague and friend, passed away peacefully on April 7th. The significance of this loss for the church history community is beyond words. And although we are greatly saddened by Alma's passing, we are comforted knowing that his legacy lives on in the many students and summer interns he has inspired over the decade. So tonight, I invite you to join me in honoring Alma Blair's legacy by helping fund this life-changing program. In fact, we care so deeply about this program for young adults that our board of directors will match the first $20,000 in donations received for the campaign. The goal of the campaign is to raise $50,000 to fund 8 young adult interns serving in the Alma Blair Internship Program at Community of Christ Historic Sites. I like to think that when you give to this summer program, in many ways, you're making an investment in future leaders, historians, curators, and storytellers. Thank you for your consideration and for helping preserve both Alma's enduring legacy and church heritage through your support. Lexi will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat, and I thank you all for your support, friends. Now, the schedule for today is in the chat, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest historian this evening. Dr. Amy DeRogatis is Professor of Religion and American Culture and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University. She's the author of Saving Sex, Sexuality and Salvation in American Evangelicalism, published by Oxford Press in 2015, and Moral Geography, Maps, Missionaries, and the American Frontier, published by Columbia in 2003. As well as a number of articles on religion, sexuality, and gender. Dr. DeRogatis most recently completed a 10-year collaborative digital project with her co-PI, Isaac Weiner from OSU. It was called the American Religious Sounds Project. The final output of their research was a collaboration with the Smithsonian Institute. They finalized and launched the Smithsonian Institute traveling exhibit drawn from the digital archive in January of this year. The exhibit is free and is now available for tour. So if you'd like to learn more about this awesome exhibit and project, we have dropped a couple of links in the chat that explores all the wonderful details behind the American Religious Sound Project. Thank you, Amy, for sharing these links with us, and thank you for sharing with us tonight. Amy's time is limited with us this evening, but we want to hear as much as we can from her about Elvira Eliza Field. So as a result, we're not going to have a Q&A period following her lecture. We're really grateful that she is carving out time for us in the midst of a very busy time in the academic world. Amy's presentation is titled Charley's a Gal, Elvira Eliza Field, James Jesse Strang's First Plural Wife. So welcome, Amy. I'll turn things over to you as we're all ready to hear the story of Elvira Eliza Field.
Well, thank you so much, Barb, and thank you to everyone who's here. It's just lovely to be here. In the spirit of what's happening in the chat right now, I want to say hi from East Lansing, Michigan. I'm in my office in Wells Hall on the 7th floor at Michigan State University and Eastern time, and I'm just really, really happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Okay, Charley's a gal, James Jesse Strang's first plural wife, Elvira Eliza Field. So there's an image that's been on my mind for many years, and you're looking at it. The image, it sits on my desk. It's a printed copy of a digital photo of this daguerreotype of Elvira Eliza Field, the first plural wife of Prophet James Jesse Strang. Field is dressed as Charles J. Douglass, or Charley, as Field was called, for 6 months during the fall of 1849 and spring of 1850. Elvira Field, a young Mormon woman from Michigan, secretly married Strang on July 13, 1849, and traveled with him later that year on an East Coast church mission. Dressed as his fictitious nephew, Field served as Strang's personal secretary and close confidant during the mission. The original photograph that you're looking at is housed in special collections in the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. Digital copies of the image are all over the internet, and reproductions can be found in public archives, books, and personal holdings. I came across this image early in my research of James Jesse Strang. Anyone who has spent time on the topic of 19th century Mormons who followed Strang has definitely seen a copy. Over the past years, I've used it in public talks and used it in teaching. For me, the image serves as an entryway into the fascinating religious movement that culminated in the crowning of a Mormon king, the proclaimed true successor of the prophet Joseph Smith, on a remote island in the middle of Lake Michigan. Strang's story is rich with metallic plates, angel visitations, visions, secret rituals, new scripture, political intrigue, and scrappy fights with Brigham Young. But what really caught my attention to this new religious movement was Elvira Eliza Field, specifically the short time that she pretended to be Charley Douglass. To tell you her story, let me first give you a quick review of James Jesse Strang, and in it talk a little bit about American religious history. So, as you know, when Joseph Smith, the prophet and founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was shot on June 27, 1844, the Mormon community was left without an obvious successor. The turmoil and uncertainty of the succession crisis in the early days after Smith died created a space for a leadership contest. James Jesse Strang, a recent convert, saw and spoke with angels, found buried metal plates with new scripture, and received a highly contested letter of appointment from Joseph Smith. Strang, who initially distinguished himself from his fiercest competitor, Brigham Young, by, among other things, rejecting plural marriage, would eventually convince many people of his rightful position and lead a large group to Beaver Island, Michigan, where he sought to establish a millennial kingdom. While on Beaver Island, he was crowned king, built a tabernacle, established the law of the Lord, and instituted, eventually, plural marriage. It's notable that he was also elected to the Michigan House of Representatives 2 times, and historians of the Strangite movement like to say that this was the only time in American history that a monarch was elected to a government position. For many reasons, James Jesse Strang angered Gentiles living on Beaver Island, Mackinac Island, in the area that is now called Charlevoix. A few disaffected followers with the implicit support of the federal government assassinated him in 1856. Within a few weeks, his followers were forcibly removed from the island and their land and property repossessed by the mob that pushed them out. James Strang's vision of himself as prophet and king was deeply millennial. He sought to create a kingdom of God on earth with himself as God's representative monarch. But he was not the only religious leader seeking to create the kingdom of God on earth in early 19th century America. Besides the prophet Joseph Smith, John Humphrey Noyes, here the gentleman with the beard, Ellen White on the other side, who was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists, and followers of Ann Lee, commonly known as the Shakers, as well as other Christian religious groups, experimented with communal living, marriage, sexual practices, work and dress habits as they sought to usher in the kingdom of God. So in this time period, particularly in antebellum America, we have mystics experiencing ecstatic visions, and unlikely leaders, including women and children, produce new texts and rituals. The tremendous religious activity that's spread across frontier communities and focused on the effort to perfect bodies and souls while believers waited for the millennium to arrive. Prophets roamed the landscape, visionaries predicted the end of the world, and ordinary people abandoned their families to join spiritual communities that offered new structures of belief and practice. In the early and mid-19th century, the Great Lakes region was fertile ground for these types of groups. So, James Jesse Strang grew up in Western New York in the early 19th century, and this was an area that people during the time called the burnt over district. Historians have kind of renamed it the burned over district, but it was called that because of the fires of Protestant, mostly, revivals burned so fiercely. So he grew up in the mix of all this religious fervor. In his youth, he kept a secret personal diary written partially in code, in which he expressed the desire to attain fame and power by marrying royalty. Although a Baptist, he described himself in his diary as a cool philosopher and a freethinker. Eventually, he would practice law, serve as a county postmaster, edit a newspaper, and distinguish himself as a debate champion and lecturer on temperance. He married Mary Peirce in 1836, and within 12 years, they had 4 children. In February of 1844, Strang traveled to Nauvoo, Illinois, converted to Mormonism, was baptized by Joseph Smith, and ordained by Smith's brother Hiram. Strang was then commissioned by Smith to set up a stake in his new home, Voorhee, near Burlington, Wisconsin. A few months later, Smith was dead. In fairly short order, newly converted Strang set out to claim the mantle of the prophet. To accomplish this feat, Strang reported that at the moment of Joseph Smith's death, he received a vision from an angel who anointed his head with oil and proclaimed, quote, "In righteousness shall thou rule." He also received a letter of appointment that Strang alleged was written by Joseph Smith. While many people disputed the authenticity of the letter, others were convinced that the letter proved Strang's authority. Strang's visual and spiritual experiences with angels, as well as his ability to find and translate buried plates, demonstrated for many his prophetic character. Equally important, Strang vehemently disavowed spiritual wifery, as plural marriage was also called, setting himself apart from Brigham Young. The Mormon community, as you all know, was deeply divided over whether polygamy was sanctioned, and many of Strang's earliest followers joined his group because of his vocal opposition to plural marriage. Strang gathered his small community in Voorhee, Wisconsin, but within 4 years, he moved the headquarters to Beaver Island, Michigan. It was during that transitional moment that he first set eyes on the 18-year-old Ms. Field. So I'd just like to show you where Beaver Island is on the map. And this is a map from, today. You can see Beaver Island is way up near the Straits of Mackinac. Mackinac Island's on the other side. It's just below the Lower Peninsula. If you were going to try to get there by boat, you would drive to Charlevoix and go out. It would take you 2 hours on the ferry. This is a map that was drawn around the time that he was in Beaver Island. And here is a close-up of it, so you can see what that looks like. Okay. So, who was Elvira Eliza Field? Elvira Eliza Field was a seamstress and school teacher from Eaton Rapids, Michigan, who met Strang's missionaries in the winter of 1847. In April of 1848, with her parents and brother Albert, she attended a conference in Voorhees, Wisconsin, and a year later, the family moved to Beaver Island, Michigan. That summer, one of Strang's close and very colorful associates, George J. Adams, delivered a marriage proposal on Strang's behalf, explaining that soon James Strang would establish a divine kingdom and that he had picked Field to be his first plural wife and queen of the kingdom. According to Adams, this new order was divinely revealed to Strang. The marriage, however, was to be kept secret, and it took place somewhere in Michigan on July 13th, 1849, probably on Beaver Island. Then Strang arranged for his new wife to accompany him on the East Coast missionary trip. So from September 1849 to March 1850, Elvira Eliza Field traveled with Strang, disguised as his 16-year-old nephew, Charles J. Douglass. To accomplish this feat, Field cut her hair, dressed in men's clothing, and adopted masculine mannerisms. Dressing as Douglass, Field understood her ruse as an important step in building Strang's millennial kingdom. Her parents had no idea that she married Strang and traveled with him. They worried for months about her disappearance and sent her brother Albert to look for her during her absence. There are a few letters in the Strang collection at the Beinecke Library in Yale that mention Albert visiting communities and asking around about his sister. And there's one letter from Elvira to James Jesse Strang in the collection stating how badly she felt that her family was worried about her and didn't know her whereabouts. Many years later, in an interview with one of Elvira's sons, Clement, he stated that Strang had encouraged Elvira to disguise herself and not tell her family because church members were not yet ready for plural marriage, and he did not want them to know he was traveling with a woman. So scholars have debated the reasons why Strang changed his position on plural marriage, but they're not debating that he practiced it. That is not a debate here. Strang eventually argued that plural marriage was a good because it solved some very pressing social problems. And like some other leaders in the 19th century new religious movements, Strang believed that heterosexual monogamous marriage disadvantaged his female followers. So the way he comes up with this, and this is not out of line with what some other leaders of religious movements are saying. He's making actually sort of a semi-eugenics argument, and it reminds me a lot of an argument that John Humphrey Noyes of the United Perfectionists made. And it kind of goes like this. It was that plural marriage, or in the United Perfectionists, complex marriage, was a situation in which women should be able to mate with superior men. And those men were generally already married. So sadly, there are all these women who are left to have to settle for sort of the leftover genetic pool of single men. And isn't that a shame? And so that plural marriage allowed for sort of superior mating. Very, very similar to some other leaders, and particularly John Humphrey Noyes. But whatever the reasons were for Strang's reversal, he initially kept plural marriage a secret, and for 6 months, Field dressed as a man. So let me tell you a little bit about the image. At some point during the 6 months, Elvira Eliza Field, dressing as Charley Douglass, probably visited a daguerreotypist and commissioned this image of herself. And I say probably because I've been investigating the provenance of this specific image to determine its authenticity, and there are a couple little questions that have come up about it. But let me describe it to you. So this daguerreotype is small. It is 2 3/4 inch by 3 1/4 inch in size. It's in a hinged square wooden case covered with maroon tooled leather. When closed, the case is about 1 inch thick. It's housed, as I said, at the Clark Historical Library, and it is with a set of other daguerreotypes. So there's a slip of paper that identifies it as Elvira Field. You see Charles J. Douglass, wife of James Strang. And it says that it was probably taken in New York State in the early part of 1850. That is probably not correct. It was probably taken in the fall of 1849. It also says that it's from the Mormon collection of C.W. Ellison of Lansing. So there are 2 other daguerreotypes that are with it, that were deposited with it, and they're Strang family members, and they have a similar identifying note that go with it. So these 3 images were purchased from Charles W. Ellison, who worked in Lansing as a government stenographer. And he was also the proprietor of Ellison Bookshop and became president of the Michigan Historical Commission and Michigan Historical Society from 1842 to 60. In the fall of 1841, he reached out to Clement Strang. This was one of Elvira's children, and asked Clement if he would provide information about the Strang family. And they had kind of a correspondence back and forth as Ellison was going to give a talk on James Jesse Strang. We know that Clement had a picture of Elvira dressed as Charley Douglass, because in this 1838 letter, he mentions to another person who's interested in his family that he has this picture. And when Clement died in, let's see, I want to say it was in 1944, at some point, the photograph ended up with Ellison, and Ellison sold it to Clark Historical Society in 1960. So what I'm showing you right now is a letter where somebody is recounting having seen the picture and knowing that this original daguerreotype was eventually sent to Central Michigan University. So we have we definitely have 2 different ways of knowing that this particular daguerreotype made its way to Central Michigan. And it seems likely that Clement gave the photo along with some other documents to the historian Milo Quaife, and that he either gave or sold them to Ellison. So, So there's been a question regarding provenance and if this daguerreotype really is Elvira dressed as Charley. And so I think that the daguerreotype that's been passed along is the same thing, but then the question is this really a photograph of Elvira? Or is it just something that was in the family that isn't? I have not found any definitive evidence in archival records that she visited a photographer while in disguise, or that she or her contemporaries had a photo. Her son Clement, who had a photo, guessed that she might have visited a photography studio when she was in Buffalo, New York, with Strang in September 1849. but that's a guess on his part. If she did, there were 11 daguerreotypists listed in the city directory of Buffalo in 1849 to choose from. Or she also could have had her photo taken by Strang follower Lucien Foster in New York City the following month in October. Foster was present at a general conference held in New York City in October, where Charley Douglass was taking notes. We know that he had been a daguerreotypist, but I couldn't find any evidence that he was still working as a photographer in New York City in 1849. So at some point during the 6 months, Elvira Eliza Field, dressed as Charley Douglass, might have visited, and I think probably did visit, a daguerreotypist. And we know that Clement had the photo, and we know that that photo is in the Clark Historical Association. Okay. Whether or not this image is authentic, Field dressed as a man to hide the secret of her marriage. We could interpret the cross-dressing as simply a unique event related to Strang's changing stance on plural marriage. But there's more to think about when we remember that for 6 months, Field did not just dress as a man, she acted as a man and as a close relative to the prophet. In that respect, Field's cross-dressing should be considered in the context of other female religious actors and leaders who challenge gender norms through cross-dressing, rejecting sexual expectations, or transcending gender altogether. American religious history is replete with women who challenged earthly expectations of female behavior and ability through spiritual inspirations that sometimes involve name changing and a really good costume. So I'm not suggesting that Field was the equivalent of someone like Jemima Wilkinson or other 19th century female visionaries who founded and led religious groups. If you're not familiar with Jemima Wilkinson, this is a woman preacher who had a vision of God and came out of that vision and decided that she would no longer be bound by sex, that she would henceforth be called the universal friend. And as part of that, and as with her community that she led, and eventually in upstate New York, she wore robes to deny any kind of features that would be connected to gender. So she kind of became a friend, just a neutral friend outside of earthly gender categories. So you know, Field was not you know, starting her own religious group, so she's different. But Field's cross-dressing, however, should be understood in the context of crossing ritual, social, and marital boundaries by gender transgression. There are well-known examples of 19th century women who dressed as men as a strategy to accomplish a goal, such as joining a male profession. Others adopted male dress simply to move and speak in male public spaces. Some of these cross-dressing women were photographed. The most documented group were Civil War soldiers who lived and fought as men during the war, and some even continued doing so afterwards. Field cross-dressed as Charley Douglass to achieve the goal of living with her secret husband. We don't know anything other than that about her temporary transformation. What we do know is that in 1849, cross-dressing was risky business. In some cities, it was a crime. For example, in 1848 Columbus, Ohio, there was an ordinance passed to make it a crime to appear in public in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. In 1845, a New York state law prohibited people from being, quote, in public spaces disguised. Many of these laws were in place to stop enslaved people from disguising themselves while fleeing from slaveholders. But nonetheless, calling attention to herself as a woman dressed as a man could have landed Field in jail, exacted a steep fine, or potentially led to violence. It's remarkable that Elvira Eliza Field dressed as a man for 6 months, but it is perhaps even more remarkable that she acted as a man in a religious group for 6 months. Disguised as Strang's nephew, Field was his personal secretary. She participated in men's discussions and activities. She wrote and submitted articles to the Gospel Herald. And Vicky Speake has speculated that she might have fulfilled male priesthood obligations. What we know for certain is that as Charley Douglass, she reported to the Gospel Herald on progress of the East Coast missionary work and submitted her own writing on theological and social issues. Kyle Bashirs gave a terrific paper at the fall JWHA conference on the topic of her theological writings, which will be published in, I think, the next JWHA journal. So, if you're interested in that, I really recommend it. But just to give you a sample of what she was up to during the 6-month period, Field wrote articles that included the titles, "What Must a Man Do to Be Saved?" "The Kingdom of God," and "Secret Societies." The latter article on political and social issues occasioned a spirited printed response from a saint in Wisconsin. But Field's most notable writing in the Gospel Herald, however, is her reporting on accusations levied against herself. Dressed as Charles Douglass, Field became the object of speculation and the focus of questioning the legitimacy of Strang's prophetic claims. When leaders in the Strangite movement accused Douglass of being a disguised woman, because they all did, very quickly people were suspicious. When they did that, their ire was pointed at Strang, not at Field. When they publicly called for an investigation to uncover the truth of Douglass's sex, they were hoping to expose Strang as a hypocrite and a fraud. Revealing that Douglass was a woman would prove false Strang's rejection of plural marriage, a cornerstone of his claim as a legitimate successor to Joseph Smith. The first hint of accusation published in the Gospel Herald did not mention Douglass specifically. As Strang's secretary and the clerk for the conference held in New York City in October 1849, Field recounted the accusations in a letter. Writing as Douglass, she explained, one of the accusers, Apostle Lorenzo Dow Hickey, stood in front of the conference and stated that he, quote, was an apostle and that he denounced Mr. Strang as a liar, an impostor, a false prophet, and a dangerously wicked man. He charged him with being guilty of all the abominations which ever existed in Nauvoo, and he would prove it by letters he had in his pocket, which he had just received from his wife on Beaver Island. Anyone affiliated with the Strangites knew that this accusation of, quote, being guilty of the abominations which ever existed in Nauvoo referred to plural marriage. Rather than addressing the issue of whether or not Douglass was a woman dressed as a man, Strang stated that if Hickey would just produce the letters, quote, he could prove the letters false by their own words. Strang denied all the charges vehemently. The next day, Hickey was charged with making public false claims against the prophet. At a conference held in Baltimore the following month, Field reported the accusations that she was in fact a woman and editorialized about the mental stability of the accusers. After noting that Hickey had been suspended, Field, writing as Douglass, remarked, quote, the cloud that had rested on Hickey's brow for several days was gone, but a kind of nervous twitching, which sometimes marks incipient insanity and not infrequently follows great mental excitement, remained. In a later edition of the Gospel Herald, Field reported that Strang again had testified that all accusations were false. By December, Strang submitted a letter to the Gospel Herald indicating that he had finally forgiven Hickey, who had, confessed of his error. But in that same issue, Field, again, writing as Douglass, wrote an article titled Slander, in which she noted, quote, "I think there is altogether too much slandering practice among the saints. They are too ready and willing to hear and cherish an evil report of a brother or sister. Whether they really believe it or not, they will tell it from one to another till at last it's taken for truth by all who hear it. The saints will never live in love and union and inherit the kingdom of God until they quit slandering one another." So here Field is obviously talking about herself being slandered. Field not only reported the accusations that threatened to unmask her, she also editorialized on the accuser's mental stability and chastised them for poor behavior. So the sex of James Strang's personal secretary was also the topic of conversation among members of a Strangite congregation, in Philadelphia, and filled pages of letters between Strang and that group. Rumors quickly circulated about Douglass's sex. In a series of strongly worded letters, Strang attempted to uncover who initiated and spread the malicious attacks on Douglass. In a letter to Strang, one congregant, John Erzbruch, denied that he spread false rumors about Douglass, but did, however, remember commenting on, quote, "the physiological peculiarities of the young man." In a response letter dated 3 days later, Strang accused Erzbruch of knowingly initiating the scandal. And he really doubles down on this. And so this is what he says back to him. Strang says, quote, "Don't you know that the mere suspicion, no matter how unfounded, that I travel with a female in disguise would be taken up by 1,000 tongues each of whom would start asserting it, stating it as holy writ? Are you so ignorant of human nature as not to know that the mere suggestion that a traveling friend of mine had one single feminine physiological peculiarity must inevitably fall upon me as a distinct charge of keeping a concubine?" Another congregant, Peter Hess, in a letter to Strang, explained that one person recognized Douglass as a sister who they saw on Beaver Island, and knew that by a certain mark on his face, the shape of her head, and the size of her feet and hands. According to Hess, another congregant, Brother Braidwood, said that Charley, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, describing his head, eyes, and voice, breasts and arms and hands and thighs and feet, and posterior, was as being every whit a woman. So people were not fooled by this. While the accuser's primary attention remained on exposing Strang as a fraud and a liar, they also raised concerns about breaking social conventions. Along with theological accusations of spiritual whiffery were suggestions of illicit sex. Strang became incensed by the accusations that he challenged the accusers, who were sure that Charley was female, to have their daughters spend the night in his bed. In a letter to Amos Lowen, he writes, quote, "I am informed also that a Mrs. Long pretended that she had a dream that Douglass was a woman. A pretty way that is to practice to have a gift of revelation. I wonder if she has a daughter that she would be willing to give him for a bedfellow." Fortunately for Strang, he bet correctly, and no one was willing to accept his challenge. In the late spring of 1850, Field returned to Beaver Island, and when she did, she was dressed as a woman. But accusations that Charley was a girl and Strang practiced plural marriage continued to divide the Strangites. As late as June 16, 1850, James Canny and his wife wrote a letter to Strang documenting a mock trial that had been held in Philadelphia, where witnesses came up and repeatedly charged Charley was a gal. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the letter, and I've blown up just one instant of where somebody is saying Charley was a gal, but it happens multiple times in this letter, and this letter is held at the Beinecke Rare Book Library at Yale University. So in this letter, that details this mock trial, one sister accuser noted she saw Charley's bare feet and knew that they were not a man's feet. This feet thing comes up a few times. Another witness said she found, quote, a mess of bloody cloths that sometimes women use, and stated, again quoting, the cat's out of the bag, sure enough. Oh dear. This pseudo Charley turns out to be a filthy and abominable menstruous hussy. The final judgment of the mock trial was that James Strang and Charley should be sent into perpetual exile. Despite the lingering controversy in Despite the lingering controversy, in July 1850, an elaborate coronation ceremony, Strang was crowned king. The congregation affirmed his rule and vowed to keep God's laws in the final kingdom. About 9 months after his coronation, in April 1851, Elvira delivered her first child, cheekily named Charley. By the spring of 1852, Strang openly acknowledged and defended the practice of plural marriage and established the law of the Lord for both believers and Gentiles. Soon after, female saints were required to wear a bloomer-like costume. Again, this very common in many of these new religious movements. Again, the United Perfectionists wore a similar costume. The adoption of the new female outfit was consistent with trends in women's dress reform in the 1850s and in other primarily Christian new religious movements. In the Book of the Law of the Lord, chapter 39, titled Apparel and Ornaments, it states that there are financial and health reasons why women should shun restrictive fashion and adopt the new costume. Not all Mormon women welcomed this new dress code. We know of one woman who embraced it, Elvira Eliza Field. Already accustomed to wearing pants as Charley Douglass, presumably Field easily adopted the new dress style. Dictating this unfashionable dress reform did not endear Strang to some of the island women, and his insistence on controlling their dress by asking them to wear manly clothes would ultimately lead in part to his demise. As you heard Vicky discuss last week, Strang would eventually marry 4 plural wives. Before Strang was assassinated, for about 6 years, Elvira was his close companion, continuing to help him as a private secretary in most business matters. She also was really interested in sort of science and nature. She maintained a daily meteorological log and possibly taught school on Beaver Island. When Strang was assassinated in July of 1856, she had 3 children and was pregnant with a 4th. After they got kicked off of the island, Elvira lived in Voree with a sister wife, Betsy McNutt, for a while after Strang's death, and then moved to Jackson County, Wisconsin, and eventually made her way back to Eaton Rapids, Michigan in 1860. We have a lot of documentation of the story of her trip back to Michigan. She told it many times, other people retold it. And on the trip to Michigan with her children on the train, Elvira's money was stolen. And soon after their family arrived in Michigan, they all became very ill. Destitute and desperate, Elvira was forced to indenture her children to people in the neighboring town of Charlotte. Vicky Speak actually has found the indentured the papers that show the indentures of all of the children. It's really deeply sad and also a remarkable find. So her kids had to go into this type of indenture service. And then by 1864, the census for Eaton County has Elvira listed on it. So her name is spelled Alvira, but she is listed, and she listed her job as a seamstress. And also she lists that she had 3 children living with her at the time. We also know that she taught school and that she was a housekeeper to help make ends meet. So over time, she, as you can see from the census, she was able to bring her 3 older children home to a small cabin close to Charlotte, where her youngest remained with the family, who ended up adopting him and changing his name from James Jesse Strang to Charles Greer. They saw each other. They lived close and they saw each other and knew each other, but he was part of the Greer family. By 1865, Elvira, who was still known to wear bloomers on occasion, met and married a widower named John Baker, who had 5 children of his own. They moved around a bit, but finally settled in Lake County, Michigan, where he worked in lumber and held some local government positions. He was a Universalist, another small religious movement that believed in the universal salvation of everyone. So it was opposed to predestination. Eventually, years later, in the 60s, they joined with the Unitarians. But for many years, there's a small Protestant group that was very opposed to predestination and often flourished in more rural areas. And that's more than you wanted to know about Universalists. But he was a Universalist. And like Elvira, he refrained from tobacco and alcohol. At some point, Elvira, in a letter to Wingfield Watson, mentions that members from the organized church lived a few miles away, and her interest was piqued in attending the church, but she never affiliated officially with any other religious group. And she did not teach her children the doctrines of the Strangite Church or the Mormon Church. She did participate in local Protestant church activities. Her son Clement talked about how she was interested in Christian activities in general. And by that, from what I can tell, I really think he meant Protestant. She sent her children to Sunday school at the schoolhouse, and she encouraged them always to read the Bible. For her part, Elvira could never reconcile Strang's prophetic claims with his terrible death, and she was left to wonder if Strang had been misguided. When she spoke of Strang to her children, she admitted doubts about whether God would allow a truly worthy leader to be assassinated. So Field led a very different life for 60 years after Strang's death. She kept books and documents that she shared with her children when they grew up, but she apparently did not mention her cross-dressing. In later years, Field and Strang's first child, Charles, named after Charley Douglass, agreed to publish his father's materials. In a correspondence with Lorenzo Dow Hickey, yes, the very same Lorenzo Dow Hickey, Charles Strang agreed to, quote, devote all of my spare time and money to publishing Strang's virtues as a man and public officer, but will not write one line or give one penny in defense of the creed. Charles Strang explained that he had been collecting materials for a few years and had recently come across a manuscript that described his mother dressed as Charley. After learning of his mother's disguise in the 1880s, he became convinced that his father was a liar and therefore a theological fraud. It's notable that Charles Strang focuses on his father's deception and the hurt that it caused his family and followers, but not on his mother's actions. So the cross-dressing for Charles Strang was evidence of deceit that unmasked his father as a false prophet. Although Hickey hoped that Elvira's firstborn son would agree to serve as the movement's leader, Charles Strang unequivocally declined. In a letter to Hickey, he made the connection quite clear. Quote, "If you know anything of Charley Douglass, as certainly you must, you can understand why I do not believe in Strangism." So what you're looking at on this slide is one of Charles Strang's day diaries, and there are a whole number of them that are in the Michigan Historical Archive in Lansing, Michigan. And he was in the habit of, after he would write a letter to someone important, and specifically here, Lorenzo Dow Hickey, he would copy out the letter in his diary. And so you can see on this sort of blown up on the right side, mentioning about Charley Douglass was no girl. And that was really a breaking point for him. So many years after Strang's death, Elvira Eliza Field Strang Baker would sit for another photo. In her late 70s, she was photographed with her second husband, first legal husband, John Baker, and here they are. So I've been puzzling for a while over the question of why Elvira would take a photograph of herself dressed as Charley Douglass. Given that cross-dressing was illegal in the state where she probably was photographed, and considering that being found out as the secret Plural wife would have dire consequences for Strang, why document it? I shared some thoughts on this in a talk I gave last fall at the JWHA conference, and all of that will be published in the next issue of the journal. One of the things I suggested was that having a photograph taken might have provided a type of tangible proof that could be held and seen and maybe circulated of what was clearly not a very believable disguise. I think it is also possible that the photograph was taken simply as a memento between lovers that was kept private for their amusement and passed down in the family. I also wonder if taking the photograph was a calculated, brave first move that helped Field to embody a new persona that allowed her to speak and act more freely as a man in this religious group. I don't doubt that at this moment in her life, she believed that Strang was a prophet and that her disguise was temporary and a small part in a larger plan to build God's kingdom on earth. But dressed as a man, for 6 months, she experienced the freedom to write and publish her thoughts, to be taken seriously, and to move in social and religious circles that were closed to women. I like to imagine that it was her idea to take the photograph as a way to mark the beginning of a new, albeit risky, chapter in her life. Until I find documentary evidence for why the photograph was taken and how it was used, all I have is conjecture about this fantastic object that provides a unique entry into 6 remarkable months in the life of Elvira Eliza Field. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. I mean, you truly made Elvira's story come alive, and what an absolute fascinating story it is. I really appreciated hearing the provenance behind the daguerreotype too. We don't always get those wonderful and fascinating details. So thank you, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, for sure, for sure.
Great. I hate to scoot off, but I'd love to talk to anybody about this further. I had the opportunity to meet some of the descendants, but if anybody knows why she took that photograph of herself, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Elvira Eliza Field, I encourage you to check out Amy's article in the most recent John Whitmer Journal. It just came out. The article that she referred to tonight is called Intimate Exposure, the Charley Douglass Daguerreotype in American Religious History. And this is the spring-summer edition of the John Whitmer Journal. And with that suggested reading assignment or homework assignment given, I'm afraid we'll now have to bring our evening program to a close. So again, thank you to our awesome guest historian, Amy DeRogatis, for joining us from Michigan and for sharing your research with us. What a wonderful night it has been, thanks to you. Also, a big thank you to Peter and Lexi for helping out behind the scenes. And lastly, we share our thanks to all of you, our dear friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Alma Blair internship program through your donations to the spring campaign. Already we've raised $200 tonight, which is matched to now $400. So thank you so much, friends, for your generosity. Now I encourage you all to tune in next week as we gather with Eric Paul Rogers to hear the story of Joseph Morris, the founding prophet and leader of the Church of the Firstborn. Eric will explore the conflict that resulted in Joseph Morris's death and the dispersion of Morris's followers among a variety of faith communities, including the reorganization or the RLDS Church. Eric's lecture is called From Morrisite to Josephite and Beyond, and it's going to be a great lecture. We hope you're all able to join us next Thursday night. So follow the link that Lexi just dropped into the chat to register for next week's lecture. And until then, keep reading your church history. Take care and have a great night, everyone.